Welcome to Life Stories, where we dive deep into the complexities of family, truth, and the emotional journeys we all face. Today, we bring you a story that will make you question the price of perfection and the hidden truths that often lie beneath the surface. A Thanksgiving gathering that seems like any other quickly unravels when secrets come to light, forcing a family to confront years of lies and buried regrets. Don't miss out on this heartfelt story of love, betrayal, and the powerful lessons life has to offer. Subscribe now to begin today's story. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands, while gazing out of the window at the frost-covered garden outside. The temperature had dropped suddenly, almost as if announcing the arrival of winter. It was the kind of winter that grips you by the bones. One where even the faintest breeze feels sharp enough to cut through your coat. The snowflakes were starting to settle lightly on the grass, giving the garden an almost ethereal, untouched look. Autumn leaves still lingered on the branches, their vibrant colors now dulled by the frost that clung to them like a memory. I watched it all in silence, knowing deep down that this winter would be different, not just because of the weather, but because of the undercurrent of tension that seemed to hang over our family. As the days grew shorter and the cold crept into every corner of our home, another Thanksgiving season was approaching. Our house stood in the suburban neighborhood of Maplewood, a small community where everyone knew each other, where it was easy to pretend everything was perfect, and easy to keep the cracks hidden beneath a shiny surface. But even here, the frost creeping in felt like an omen. The world outside might have seemed calm, but inside, things were far from it. My career as a senior accountant at a major firm was going well, and I had a stable home life with my husband, David. He was a gentle soul, someone who understood me, always supportive, always there when I needed him. Our life together seemed perfect on the surface, but the cracks were starting to show. David had been working tirelessly as an executive in a tech company. His career was on the rise, but that also meant more time away from home, more late nights, more business trips. This year, he would miss Thanksgiving altogether due to an important business trip, a trip that could make or break the success of his company's new project. I had tried to hide my disappointment, but deep down, I felt a pang of loneliness. The holidays had always been a time for family, a time for gathering, and yet this year, even the idea of family felt like a distant, fleeting thing. As I stood there, trying to shake off the feeling, I heard David's voice calling from behind me. "Amy, are you ready?" I turned around to see him already dressed in his suit, holding his travel suitcase, looking every bit the part of the busy executive he was. His face, gentle yet weary from the pressure, held the same concern for me as always. His eyes met mine with that familiar, quiet understanding. "Yes, I'm fine," I replied, smiling despite the unease inside me. "Don't worry." But even as I spoke those words, I could feel the strain in my chest. I had told my mother that David wouldn't be able to make it for Thanksgiving, but she hadn't been happy about it. "I can't believe you're putting work before family," she had said, her voice tinged with disappointment. I mimicked her words to David with a hint of bitterness. I told her, "She's still upset." It's not the first time she's said something like that. David reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'll be fine. I'll handle it my way." David didn't push further. He understood, as he always did. His silent nod was enough. It was one of the reasons I had always loved him. He knew when to give me space and when to offer his support. Tomorrow would be Thanksgiving, and the usual crowd would gather at my mother's house, my sister Rachel and her husband, Mark, and their son, Tommy. It was the same every year. The same rituals, the same forced smiles, the same tense conversations. And yet, something felt different this time. Something felt like it was about to crack open, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. There had always been a strange dynamic in our family. My mother, Evelyn, was the matriarch of the family, a respected and powerful woman who had earned her place in the community. As an influential member of the First Presbyterian Church, she had always been at the center of social events and charitable activities. Her presence loomed large over everything we did, her sense of pride in our pure bloodline guiding her every action. But it was a pride that came with a price. After I suffered a miscarriage 2 years ago, her attitude subtly shifted. Though she remained outwardly affectionate, I began to notice a certain relief in her eyes. It was a relief that seemed to have nothing to do with me, but everything to do with my inability to carry on the family line. And yet, her doting on Rachel's son, Tommy, grew more intense with each passing year. Rachel, in turn, seemed to live in my mother's shadow, always deferring to her, always prioritizing her opinions, even when it came to raising her own child. And then there was Rachel's husband, Mark, a kind-hearted man who owned a small real estate company. He had recently begun to show signs of stress, but I couldn't figure out why. There were whispers, but no one ever said anything directly. As David grabbed his suitcase and made his way to the door, I felt the familiar chill settle deeper in my chest. Tomorrow, everything would change. Something was about to be revealed, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But my instincts, honed through years of analyzing numbers and reading people, told me that this was no ordinary Thanksgiving. And perhaps, like the frost outside, it would be the beginning of something far colder and more profound than I could imagine. I stood up, walking David to the door, the cold air biting at my skin as I stepped outside with him for the last time before his trip. The wind cut through my coat, carrying with it the promise of a long, difficult day ahead. Tomorrow would bring more than just turkey and stuffing. It would bring the truth. And when that truth came, there would be no going back. The following morning arrived with the kind of biting cold that seemed to seep into your very soul. The sky was a dismal gray, with occasional snowflakes swirling lazily in the air. It wasn't the soft, romantic snow of a Christmas card. This snow had a harsh, unforgiving edge to it, much like the atmosphere in my mother's house. As I drove toward her home, my thoughts were heavy. I turned up the heat in the car, but it did little to ease the tightness in my chest. The silence between me and David felt more profound than any words could convey. I had hoped this Thanksgiving would be different, that we might have one peaceful holiday. But I already knew that was too much to wish for. Too many unspoken words, too many unacknowledged wounds. I arrived at my mother's house, a large white mansion nestled in one of Maplewood's most prestigious neighborhoods. The kind of house that always struck me as both elegant and cold. As if it were more concerned with the impression it made on others than the warmth it should have offered to those who lived within. The long, circular driveway was already lined with cars, some of which I recognized as belonging to distant relatives and friends from church. I could hear the soft murmur of voices as I opened the front door. "Amy, is David really not coming?" My mother's voice rang out from the kitchen before I had even fully stepped inside. She didn't wait for an answer before continuing, her tone laced with reproach. "That's disappointing. Always putting work before family. Don't you think that's wrong?" I winced, even though I had known it was coming. The same criticism, the same judgment. No matter how much I tried to explain, she never understood. She saw family as an institution, a place to present perfection, not a space for growth, pain, or vulnerability. She was always concerned with appearances, with what the neighbors and church members thought. "Yes." I explained it to her. I replied, my voice controlled, keeping the frustration in check. "David has an important business trip. We can't help it." Mother looked at me, her face tight, but she didn't say another word. Instead, she turned her attention back to the kitchen, where my Aunt Carol and cousin Jennifer were already helping with the meal preparations. The smell of turkey wafted through the air, mixing with the scent of fresh pine needles that adorned the mantel. It should have felt comforting, but instead, the familiar smells felt like a weight, pressing down on my chest. "Hello, Amy." Aunt Carol greeted me with a forced smile. There was something in her eyes, sympathy, perhaps, or pity, but I couldn't tell which. After my miscarriage 2 years ago, the way my relatives looked at me had subtly shifted. They didn't say anything, but their glances were filled with something I had trouble identifying. I gave a tight smile in return and joined them in the kitchen, helping where I could, though I felt a distance from everything happening around me. The usual small talk about church activities and neighborhood gossip filled the room. But it all felt strangely hollow. The laughter, the chatter, the clinking of silverware, it all seemed like a facade. It wasn't long before Rachel and Mark arrived, along with their son, Tommy. My mother's face brightened at the sight of her grandson, and she rushed to embrace him. "Tommy, my darling boy," she cooed, lifting him into her arms as if he were the most precious thing in the world. Rachel stood back, her expression cold and calculated, her eyes darting around the room as if she were avoiding something, or someone. Mark, her husband, looked uncomfortable as always, his uneasy glances only further adding to the tension that seemed to hang in the air. We all gathered in the dining room. The long table set with fine china and polished silverware. The centerpiece was a large, golden brown turkey, its skin perfectly crisped. The table was set with the kind of formality that always made me feel like I was walking into a performance rather than a family meal. "Let us pray," Mother began, her voice filled with a dignity I could never seem to emulate. She recited the prayer with reverence, as if the words held the power to protect us all from the truth that lay just beneath the surface. After the prayer, the serving began. The moment was supposed to feel festive, joyful even, but I felt nothing but dread. As I reached for my plate, my mother's voice cut through the tension. "Amy," she said, her tone suddenly light and almost too cheerful. "You've always been so focused on your work. Don't you think it's time to find a new purpose in life?" The question hit me like a punch. I stared at my plate, trying to hold back the emotions that were threatening to spill over. It was the same old story, the same insinuation that I wasn't living up to her expectations. But this time, the words stung more than they ever had before. Before I could respond, I heard Mother continue, her voice almost giddy now. "You know, your miscarriage saved our bloodline from being tainted. It's for the best, really." The words sliced through the air like a knife, and the room fell silent. I felt the blood rush to my face, a mixture of anger, humiliation, and disbelief flooding my body. But the worst part? The relatives around the table didn't seem shocked. Instead, they laughed, as though it was a joke. My aunt, Jennifer, gave a nervous chuckle, as if to reassure everyone that this was just a family matter, nothing to be taken seriously. Then came Rachel's voice, so soft, so casual. "After all, a grandchild is all we need," she said, gently stroking Tommy's head. That was the final blow. Time seemed to slow down, the room growing distant as I slowly set my fork down, my hands trembling. Every eye in the room turned to me, but I could hardly bring myself to look up. The truth, that long-buried truth, was about to emerge in a way none of us could have predicted. I stood up from the table, my legs feeling as if they had turned to stone. My hands gripped the back of the chair for support, but I could no longer bear to stay in that room, suffocating under the weight of their laughter and my mother's cruel words. "I need a moment," I said quietly, my voice surprisingly steady despite the storm raging inside me. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the dining room, the eyes of every family member fixed on my back as I made my way down the hallway. I stood in the living room, my back pressed against the cold window pane, staring out at the swirling snowflakes outside. The quiet, unrelenting snow seemed to echo my emotions, fragile, gentle, yet carrying an undeniable force. There was something calming about watching the world outside transform into a blur of white. A stark contrast to the turmoil I felt inside. I could still hear faint murmurs from the dining room, but it was as if I had stepped out of the reality they were living in, into a world where I could breathe, even if just for a moment. But that brief respite was soon interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, startled, and found Mark standing in the doorway, his face creased with concern. "Amy, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice lower than usual, as though he had something important, something troubling, he needed to say. I nodded, wordlessly gesturing for him to continue. He looked around cautiously, as if making sure no one could overhear, before stepping closer. "It's about Rachel," Mark said, his voice tinged with unease. "I've been noticing things that don't sit right with me. I don't know if you've noticed, but she's been spending a lot of time with the new assistant pastor, Adam, and it's not just for church business." I froze, my heart skipped a beat. Adam, the young, charismatic assistant pastor who had only arrived 6 months ago. quickly becoming a popular figure among the female church members. I had seen him, of course, at church events, but I had never thought much of it, until now. Mark continued, his voice growing quieter. I'm not sure what's going on, but I think it's more than just friendship. And I think it's been going on longer than we know. I swallowed hard, trying to process what he was saying. Are you suggesting? Yes, Mark said, cutting me off. I think there's something going on between them. And I think it goes deeper than just a fling. Amy, I need your help. I could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. The odd behavior, the tension between Rachel and my mother, the uncomfortable glances Mark had been shooting Rachel over the past few months. And now, this. Mark's suspicions about Rachel and Adam. It was too much to ignore. I need you to help me get a DNA test for Tommy, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know for sure, but I have this feeling, this gut feeling, that Tommy might not be mine. His words hit me like a freight train. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind in an instant. But the one thing that stood out the most was the unmistakable sense of certainty that had settled into my bones. Something was wrong with our family. Something far deeper than I had imagined. And yet, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I took a deep breath and met Mark's gaze. His eyes were filled with a mix of fear and resolve. And I knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't asking for this help lightly. He was desperate. The truth, whatever it was, needed to come out. I'll help you, I said quietly, the words leaving my lips before I had even fully processed them. We'll find out the truth. But we have to be careful. This could tear everything apart. Mark nodded, his shoulders sagging with the weight of what he was asking. I know, but we can't keep living this lie. We stood in silence for a moment, each of us wrestling with our own thoughts. The reality of what we were about to uncover settling in. I could feel the cold air from outside creeping into the room. As if the world itself was reminding me that there was no turning back. Thanksgiving dinner, I said suddenly, my voice sharp. What happens now? Mark sighed, rubbing his temple as if he were trying to steady his racing mind. We finish the dinner. We play our parts. But after that, everything changes. We can't go back. And so, in that moment, I knew that the Thanksgiving dinner I had dreaded would be the beginning of something far more profound than any of us could have imagined. What lay ahead would force us to confront not only the secrets of our family but also the very foundations of who we thought we were. But the truth had a way of coming to light, no matter how hard we tried to hide it. And now it was time to face it head on. As the weeks passed, the truth began to unfold in ways we never expected. The DNA test confirmed Mark's suspicions. Tommy was not his child. The revelations didn't stop there. Rachel and Adam's affair, hidden for so long, came to light, shaking the very foundation of our family. But amidst the chaos, there was an unexpected sense of clarity. The lies that had bound us together were unraveling. And while it was painful, there was a strange sense of freedom in finally acknowledging them. Mother's stroke had been a wake-up call for all of us. For years, she had lived a life dictated by appearances, always concerned with maintaining the perfect image. But in her vulnerable state, she was forced to confront the truth about her actions, the way she had used church funds to cover up Rachel's affair, the way she had buried her emotions for the sake of family reputation. And for the first time, I saw her as a human being, flawed and full of regret. Rachel's life was forever changed too. Her marriage ended, and she was estranged from the church community she had once been a part of. She had to rebuild her life from the ground up, much like our family had to. In a strange way, we were all starting over, learning the hard way that the pursuit of perfection often leads to emptiness. And only by embracing the truth could we find true peace. David and I found solace in each other's arms. We left behind the house, the town, and the shadows of our past. It wasn't the perfect beginning, but it was ours. And as I looked forward to the future, I knew that happiness built on honesty was the only foundation that would last. Thank you for following along with this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories. And share your thoughts with us in the comments below.